course, we've been making our way through what we would refer to as the Passion Week, this last week of Christ's life here on the earth. And we've talked about the garden, we've talked about the Last Supper, and what we'll see this morning is the trials of Christ have begun, and that's where that's what our text is going to be about this morning. Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 53. It says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. And Peter followed him afar off, even to the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Which is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace, and he answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. You shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And the high priest rent his clothes and saith, What need we any further witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and to say unto him, Prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. We'll stop right there. The sham that was the legal hearings, if that's a word you even want to use, over Christ's execution was about to begin. Christ, as we've seen undoubtedly throughout the last several weeks, Christ is the one willingly going to Calvary, and yet they still had to rely on false witness and slander to get him there. Now, through a legal trial after a legal trial, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, Christ showed a poise and a determination to face whatever false accusation and beating came his way as he got closer and closer to Calvary. Now, what I want to do just before we jump into the text this morning is just kind of lay out the trials that he went through. Because as you go through the Gospels, what you will notice is that none of the Gospel writers actually mention all 6 trials that Jesus faces. But when you combine the Gospels together, it's very easy to see which proceedings followed which, and to put the whole picture together. And so I just wanted to kind of walk through this with you very quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for you to see the 6 separate trials that Jesus actually faced before going to Calvary. And so let me just kind of go through this with you quickly. And so first of all, when Jesus is first led away from the garden, he is first taken to Annas. Now, you don't get that in Mark. You only get that in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 18. And it shows how they led him to Annas first. Now, Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the current high priest. Caiaphas is the one who he's meeting with in our text. And so Annas was at one point, and nobody really knows why, but at one point was removed from the office of high priest, not by the Jews, but by the Romans. And so the Romans actually removed Annas from his position, and they instituted a few other guys, I believe, before Caiaphas actually became the high priest. Now, in Judaism, the office of high priest is a lifelong position, right? And so in the minds and the eyes of the Jewish people, Caiaphas was not the legitimate high priest, Annas was. And so Caiaphas may have been the one to make all final decisions because he is the one who held the office currently. But in the minds of the people, Annas was the one with the authority. And so he was still very popular. He was still, people would seek his opinion on a lot of different things. We talked about this a long time ago, but when Jesus comes in and clears the temple, that whole area where the money changers and all that was, it was referred to as the bazaars of not Caiaphas, but the bazaars of Annas. Right? That was his doing. He still had a significant influence over the people. And so the first thing that they do is they lead Jesus to the house of Annas, not Caiaphas, because again, he's the one who, if Jesus is going to be put to death, the people want the opinion of Annas. Right? That's really what that was about. And so they take him to Annas' home first, and Annas holds a little meeting with Christ. before Christ is taken then to the home of Caiaphas. And that is the second meaning then, is where Mark picks up the story, and it is before Caiaphas and some of the elders and some of the priests. It is not the full Sanhedrin. We'll see that in the next chapter of Mark. And so essentially what this particular trial was, the one in our text, and I'm not going to go over much because we're going to see it here in just a second, but this was essentially a trial to try and gain evidence to reach a death penalty, right? That was the point of this particular trial that we'll go over here in just a moment. After Jesus has this trial with this particular group, then we'll see this in Mark 15, the next chapter. They bring together the whole council, the whole Sanhedrin, because they needed some formalities, really was all that was. And so they bring together the full Sanhedrin in Mark 15, and that's when they condemn him to death. However, as we'll see, they did not have that ability anymore. They may have put a death penalty upon Christ, but they could not actually put him to death. And so they needed Rome, right? And so this is where the Roman trials come into play. And so after the third Jewish trial begins the first Gentile trial. Now, Jesus predicted this, right? Jesus had already told the disciples that he was going to be handed over to the Gentiles, right? And so this was all happening exactly as Jesus said it was going to happen. And so after that meeting with the full Sanhedrin, Jesus is then taken to Pilate for this first meeting with Pilate. And we'll see that one also in the book of Mark. But we've discussed it in the past that the Talmud states that the right of the Jews to perform their own capital punishment had ended, and I quote, 40 years before the destruction of the temple. Well, that was this time. The temple was constructed in 70 AD, 40 years before, 30 AD. That's around the time that Jesus was crucified. And so they had just lost their ability to actually carry out capital punishment, which is why Pilate was needed. And so the Jews, again, they needed Romans to kill Jesus. And although they satisfied their laws by condemning him on theological grounds, what you'll see, as we point out as we go through further, is that when they bring him to Pilate, Pilate doesn't care about their theology. Right? And so they can't bring Jesus to Pilate and saying, hey, we've condemned him on charges of blasphemy. Pilate would have just laughed at him and told him to turn around. Right? He doesn't care about that. And so what they had to do is then they had to drum up further charges against Christ. And so they tell Pilate, they bring him and say, basically, he's trying to incite a rebellion against Rome. And we read that in the book of Luke. It says in Luke 23, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. And so what is ridiculous about that, we read the story in Mark. What did Jesus say? His own words were, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Right? He told them the exact opposite. But here, again, they can't bring him on theological grounds. That was for their law. Well, now we need to condemn him on Roman laws. And so he's inciting rebellions. He's trying to take over the throne. Well, the issue is Pilate knows he's innocent. Right? And again, we'll see all that as we go through. Pilate knows he's innocent, and he doesn't want anything to do with Christ. He has a mob in front of him who want this man dead. He doesn't want that on his conscience. And so he says, he finds out per this investigation that is going on that Jesus was a Galilean. Well, he's not the ruler over the Galilean area. And so Herod, who was the ruler over the Galilean area, was in Jerusalem because of the Passover and all the events that are going on. And so Pilate says, oh, okay, good, he's Galilean. Get him to Herod. I don't want anything to do with it. Get him to Herod. And so they take him to Herod for the fifth trial. And not much happens at this trial. Herod just basically makes a mockery of Christ. He's like, oh, you're Jesus. I've really been wanting to see you. Do a miracle. Basically is what Herod says. It's almost like he's a monkey in a circus. Hey, just do a miracle for me real fast. Well, Jesus doesn't do it. And so he mocks him and he says, I don't want anything to do with this guy. Send him back to Pilate. And so Jesus, for the last and sixth trial, stands before Pilate. And again, I'm compiling this all down, I know. But Pilate, at that point, he knows that he's kind of between a rock and a hard place. He knows he's innocent. His wife has even come to him and said, have nothing to do with the blood of this just man. But he also has a courtyard full of screaming Jews saying, crucify him, crucify him. And so what does he do? He says, my hands are innocent of this man. His blood be upon you. And the crowd calls out, let his blood be upon me and on my children. And he says, crucify him. That is what you would call kangaroo court that Jesus suffered. 6 illegal trials. 6 trials to find an innocent man guilty. and they got what they wanted. But let's go through the text here. Again, Mark 14, starting in verse 53. And they led Jesus away. Now remember, we're at the second trial now. He's left the house of Annas, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and all the elders and the scribes. Now, there was a lot of people there, but it was not the full. In fact, you see in chapter 15, verse 1, and straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. Okay, and so that was the next trial. He's not with the whole council now. There's a great number of people here, but it's not the full Sanhedrin. That'll be the next trial. So, Jesus taken to the house of Annas. Now he is taken to the house of Caiaphas for the second trial. This was an illegal meeting. And I'm going to talk about why. This was a legal meeting for this group to fix a crime to Christ, right? If you want a purpose for the second meeting, it was this. We have already condemned him as guilty. We already want him dead. We've just got to figure out a way legally to get him to that point. That's the point of the second trial. And so they wanted him dead, but they had no legal, they had no theological grounds to announce a death penalty. So, before the slightly more formal meeting, and that's really the only way that you could say that, before the slightly more formal meeting of the full Sanhedrin that happens in the next chapter, they have this trial to attempt to find, or what we will see, manufacture a reason to kill him. And so everything about this trial was, to use the term, a miscarriage of justice. If you've ever heard that term before, it has never been epitomized more than in this particular trial that Christ is about to face. And so this was an absolute miscarriage of justice by any ethical standard, not to mention by their own prescribed laws. Okay, and so what I want to do is just for a minute show you how they're not just breaking moral and ethical standards, they're breaking their own laws in order to have this particular trial with Christ. All right, so let me give you a few things here this morning. The very body determining his guilt had been plotting to kill him for some time. Right? The very body that is sitting there trying him was the very body that had been trying to destroy him, to use the biblical term, for a long time now. And so, again, what do we have built into our justice system? A fair and what? Impartial jury. An impartial jury. This jury was anything but impartial. They wanted him dead, and they would do anything in order to get the verdict that they had already deemed appropriate. And so, again, just by any kind of outside person looking in, you can see from the very beginning, this never should have happened. Secondly, everything about when the trials, and I'm going to quote some things here for you, but everything about when the trials were held and the speed of the conviction and verdict went against their direct laws. All right, now let me quote something for you here. Now, this is from the Mishnah, and this is a direct quote out of the Mishnah. Now, if you don't know what the Mishnah is, the Mishnah, I will grant you this. The Mishnah was actually written about 100 years after this, but what the Mishnah was simply a written down, collated form of the laws that have been in place in Israel for 1,000 years, essentially. And so the Mishnah, whereas it was not written until about 100 years after these events were taking place, they were writing down rules that they have had long before the events taking place in our text. And so what we read in the Mishnah, in the 4th chapter of the Sanhedrin section in the Mishnah, you can look this up yourself. In the 4th chapter of the Sanhedrin section, it says, and I quote, "In cases of capital law, the court judges during the daytime and concludes the deliberations and issues the ruling only in the daytime. In cases of capital law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling even on that same day to acquit the accused, but must wait until the following day to find him liable. Therefore, since capital cases may continue for 2 days, the court does not judge cases of capital law on certain days, neither on the eve of Shabbat or the Sabbath, nor the eve of a festival." Literally, everything about what they were doing in their laws was illegal. They were holding a trial at night. They were holding a trial during a festival. They were holding a trial the day before Sabbath. Everything that they did was illegal. They did not wait a day to pronounce a guilty verdict, right? That was their law for capital crimes. The only way that you could give a verdict the same day was if the person was found innocent. If the person was found guilty, you have to wait a day because perhaps new information comes in. And so they wait a day in order to gain more possible information to condemn a person guilty of death. And they did none of that, right? None of that was taking place. Now, we don't know the exact time. Like, I can't tell you this happened at 3:01 a.m. Well, I don't know that. We can't tell you the exact time that all these trials took place, but what we do know is that all 6 trials and the scourging of Christ took place early enough for him to be on the cross by 9 a.m. We know that much because Mark tells us in chapter 15, verse 25, and it was the 3rd hour, and the 3rd hour would be 9 a.m. It was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. And so all of these things are taking place so that by 9 a.m., Jesus is on the cross. Now, what do we know? That he was dragged from trial to trial. What do we know? He's being constantly beaten every time that he's taken somewhere. So what does that tell me? We're not moving at a very quick pace from these trials. Now, again, we don't know how close all these buildings were. But we know that Jesus had to leave the Mount of Olives to go to the house of Annas, and then he had to leave the house of Annas to go to the house of Caiaphas, and then he had to leave the house of Caiaphas to go to Pilate's house. He had to leave Pilate's house to go to wherever Herod was staying, and then back from there, back to Pilate's house. All of that taking place, not to mention the time that the trials themselves actually took place. Jesus was being beaten every single time. Pilate scourged him to try and satisfy the crowds, and all of that took place before 9 o'clock when Jesus is actually on the cross. So what does that tell me? They were not doing this in the daytime. They were doing this at night. Now, again, I can't tell you exactly what time it was, but they were doing this at night. Now, what we also know, and we'll see this next week, is that this particular trial is taking place before the denial of Peter. Jesus told Peter that he would deny him before the cock crow. Now, we know this. This is at 3 a.m. And so this particular trial is taking place sometime before 3 in the morning. What do we know? Everything that they're doing is against their own legal system. This is a sham trial. This is a kangaroo court. Let's go on. Furthermore, the witnesses were not found until the trial began, and they gave false testimony. We read that in our text. Look at verse 58. And the chief priest and all the council sought for witnesses. The trial begins, and it's like they had this thought all of a sudden, oh, you know what? Hold on. We don't actually have any witnesses against this guy. We need to go find somebody. Now, that must have been a sight. It's 3 a.m. in the morning, and they're scrummaging around trying to find some witnesses, somebody to come say something against Jesus. Matthew tells us that they were literally just trying to find somebody. And so it says to find something against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. It says, for many bear false witness against him, but their witnesses agreed not together. Even the people who came forward with something that was close to what he said, and we'll talk about that in a second, in verse 58, they said, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. And it says, but neither did their witness agree together. So they couldn't find any witnesses who would actually have any kind of corroborating story that would put this man to death. Now, furthermore, a trial, again, I don't have to tell you this, I know you know this, but a trial is not the time for investigation. Right? Once a trial begins, the investigation is over. A trial is to try what the investigation found. Right? That's just common sense. And so we understand that when a trial begins, the investigation by that point should have been done with and over. But here we have the trial, and they're thinking, oh, we've got to find some witnesses here to investigate. And so they try to do the investigation and the trial at the same time because, again, they know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing is illegal, and they know that they've got to do anything they can. They've got to throw it against the wall and see what sticks. Furthermore, per Scripture, these false witnesses should have been put to death. We read this in Deuteronomy chapter 19. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witnesses be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, it says this, then shall you do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother, so shalt thou put the evil away from among you. And so they're bringing in these false witnesses for what? A death penalty. And so the Bible, Deuteronomy tells us, if you have false witness in a legal setting, and it's proven false, that we know that they're false, and everybody there that night would have known that they were false because their stories don't even agree with one another, it says, you do to them what you were trying to do to the accused party. Well, they're accusing Jesus of the death penalty. These false witnesses should have been put to death. And then lastly, we, at least for this section, we get to Jesus' own testimony. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about the words that he said, but I'm just going to talk generally about the testimony, as it were. Now, notice, whenever the false testimony comes in, Jesus never answers a word. These false witnesses come up, They say all these things. None of it's true. Everybody knows it's not true. And yet, Caiaphas still pushes the matter. Jesus, what do you say about these things? Jesus never opens his mouth. Why? He doesn't have to self-incriminate. That's in our own laws today still. He doesn't have to self-incriminate. Everybody knows that what they just said is false. Everybody knows that what they said is not true. I don't have to answer to this sham, right? That's what's going on. And so this was beyond that, a fulfillment of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, and then it says this, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Again, all of this was prophesied before it ever took place. The false witnesses there in verse number 58, the false witnesses said this, here's what we heard Jesus say. Jesus said, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. That's not actually what Jesus said. We read this in John chapter 2. John tells us exactly what Jesus said. Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's what it says. And then John goes on to tell us he was speaking about the temple of his body. Jesus made this clear. The people knew what he said. The people knew what he meant. They may not have believed it, but they knew what he said. They knew what he meant, and yet they said, Jesus said that he would destroy the physical temple, and in 3 days that he would build the physical temple again. That's not what he said. It was false witness. It was slander. However, when he was asked about the truth, he answered. When he was asked about the truth, he answered. Finally, there in 61, but he held his peace and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him and said unto him, finally, a true, honest question. He says, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. Doug Stewart said this, they never stopped to consider the possibility that Jesus was telling the truth. There was not the slightest interest in attempting to find out whether Jesus may indeed be the promised Messiah. There was no evidence that was allowed to be given on Jesus' behalf, and they weighed no evidence before making their judgment. It was simply as soon as the statement was made, we see here the reaction, verse 63, then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, what need we any further witness? Again, we're talking about a legal setting, and from a legal setting, when a person gives testimony, what do? You examine the testimony, right? That's what happens in any good, honest court. You examine the testimony that is given. Jesus gives testimony. This would be the akin to somebody giving a testimony in court and the judge standing up and saying, I'm saying the trial is over. Just listen to what the guy just said. We don't need anything else, right? Nobody would allow that. The session would be thrown out. The trial would be retried with a different judge, right? That would not be allowed to happen in any good, true, honest court. Well, this isn't a good, true, honest court. Again, this is a kangaroo court and a sham trying to find an innocent man guilty, and they will do anything they can to get the guilty verdict. But let's look specifically about what Jesus said. Verse 62. And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now the answer Jesus gives was, in my estimation, likely the last thing they expected to hear him say. Again, think of the setting. They know what they're doing. Jesus knows what they're doing. They know that they're trying to pin false charges against an innocent man. Jesus knows they're trying to pin false charges against him. And the natural thing to do in a situation like that, if you were somebody other than Jesus, and you were in that situation, and you know that in your position that you have no authority over this body that is condemning you to death, probably what would take place in those moments is self-preservation. All right? Self-preservation. Jesus could have simply said, I am, and left it alone. I am exactly what you said I am. But he doesn't just leave it alone. He goes further, and he adds more on top of it. And this is what I love about this particular section. And so Jesus knows that it was a bold question, but he does not weaken his answer. Right? He doesn't weaken his answer at all. First of all, we understand this. He says, I am. Now, if you've read through the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, you'll understand the implication of such a statement. When Jesus says, I am, That's him equating himself with Jehovah of the Old Testament. It's like Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush, when God calls himself the great I am, right? This is Jesus saying, I am that man. I am Jehovah. I am God. We are one and the same. In fact, if you go read the Gospel of John, the last time that Jesus told the crowd that I am, it says that they took up stones to kill him because they knew and they understood the implications of such a word, of such a statement. And so Jesus here starts off by saying, I am, but he goes further. He doesn't just say that I am. He says, not only am I God, but let me tell you something else. He says, when you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. So not only am I God, but guys, just buckle up because it's not over. Right? That's essentially what he's telling them here. And what he does here is he uses a couple of Old Testament passages. This was a phrase full of prophecy. He says, first of all, he's going to be sitting at the right hand of power. That was in reference to Psalm 110. Psalm 110, verse 1, it says, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. This was a position of authority, a position of power. It was a position equated with God the Father. And again, Jesus says, that is me. And then he says, coming in the clouds of heaven. That was a reference to Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, it says this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and this that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Here is Jesus standing before the very people who in just a few short hours are going to be the means by which he goes to the cross, and he says, it's not over. You will see me again, and the next time you see me, it's not going to be in frail humanity. It's going to be my full glory coming in the clouds of heaven to be judge over you to gain my kingdom, which go on for everlasting, a dominion without end. You may think you have an authority over me, and the only authority you have is the authority that I allow you to have over me in this moment, but this is not the end. Jesus didn't just say, yeah, that's me. He said, yeah, that's me, and let's put a little bit more on it. You don't have the authority you think you have. Essentially, he tells them this. Not only am I everything you say I am the one who will return and who will rule the kingdom of all nations with an everlasting dominion. That's the man who stands before you. That's the man you're trying to throw the book at. That's the man who stands before you innocent. This tells us a couple of things. First, as I just said, Jesus was letting Caiaphas know that he may be the one being judged now, but there's coming a day where Jesus is going to be the judge, and it's going to be his kingdom. Second, knowing the cross was only a few short hours away, Jesus was looking beyond the cross to the kingdom where he would be glorified instead of rejected. Now, Jesus knew that the glorification would not come until the rejection took place in full force at Calvary. But again, what this shows us is that Jesus knew that there was an after Calvary. There was a time beyond the cross. The glory was coming. The cross was simply the destination to get to the glory. And this leads, again, as I said earlier, this leads Caiaphas to rend his clothes, to tear his clothing. And he says, what need we any further witnesses? We've heard the blasphemy. It really wouldn't have mattered what Jesus had said in that moment. Again, we know that. They've already condemned him. Right? The only purpose of this was to drum up whatever false evidence they could find to justify the verdict that they had already concluded was true. And so it really didn't matter what Jesus said there. There was going to be no pleasing what was a bloodthirsty group. That's what they were. They were a bloodthirsty group. They wanted Jesus dead. And so what we see in verse 63 is Caiaphas just putting on the theatrics. That's what this was. This was Caiaphas putting on the theatrics. Rending the clothes was typically a sign of extreme grief or extreme indignation, one of the two. Here it was simply Caiaphas trying anything to make it look like Jesus was really guilty and that he really cared about the things of God, neither of which were true. But this was Caiaphas trying to make it look so. And then the death penalty was laid down. Again, he asked this, I've used the phrase already, but this kangaroo court, what do you think about this? We've heard the blasphemy, and it says there at the end of 64, and they all condemned him to be guilty of death. They've already done that. They did that before Jesus ever entered those halls. But here they try to make it look like it was something even in the form of legality. Now, the word justice is thrown around a lot these days, and never has there been a lack of justice more than in the case that we just saw. The only innocent man to ever live, condemned to death by what was an illegal kangaroo court. In conclusion this morning, the verdict was in place. The only thing they were waiting on at this point was, as I mentioned earlier, the ever so slightly more legal, formal meeting of the whole council. And so essentially what we can assume took place now, they've already condemned him to death, but they know their laws that they can't meet at night, right? And so what we can assume happened at this point was that they were essentially waiting for the first crack of dawn, and they all met together as the whole council to make this, what was in their minds, a justified formal meeting of the full Sanhedrin. But we know that it was anything but. Now that they have called Jesus a blasphemer worthy of death, what I want you to see here in verse 65, Hebrews talks about the shame of the cross. And we know that there's more shame to come. Jesus was stripped of his clothing upon the cross. We know this. But the shame began before, again, like I said earlier, before there was ever a nail in his hands. Verse 65, and some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, prophesy, and the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. They've condemned him as someone who's blasphemed against God. They've condemned him as somebody who is worthy of death. And so now they find that they have given themselves excuse to play out their sick fantasies of violence against this man that they hate so much. We see here at the end of the verse that the officers, and that word servants, that's what that's in reference to, that the officers begin to hit him. But who starts it? It's not them. Who starts it? It's the very elders and chief priests, the people of the council there in verse 60, and some begin to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, prophesy. You see, they hated this man. I can only imagine that prior to this event, they've already fantasized in their minds about how they would like to carry out the sick violence against this man Jesus. Well, now they've said he's a blasphemer. Now they said he's worthy of death. And so now we're going to carry out every bit of shameful punishment that we can upon the very one dying for the sins that they were currently committing. And this is the part that really begins to weigh on me, to think about everything that Jesus gave up, all the glory that he had in heaven, the angels surrounding the throne saying, holy, 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 to come to earth, to enter into the humility of the human body and to experience humanity that was humbling enough as it is, and yet to endure the shame of these men who had no real authority over Jesus, only the authority that he allowed them to have. But to endure the shame as they spit upon him, as they blindfold him and hit him and say, hey, prophesy. If you're really the Son of God, you could tell me who it was who just hit you. Isaiah tells us they pluck out his beard. He never stops it. What did Jesus tell his disciples in the garden? Guys, if I wanted to, at any moment, I could call down more than 12 legions of angels, and this would be over. But he didn't. He went forward. He kept going. He endured it. He allowed the spittle to run down his face. He allowed the beating to take place. He knew every fist that was coming in contact with his face. And yet he said, I love you still. And he kept going. And he took the nails. And he took the cross. And he took the crown of thorns. And he bled. And he died for the very ones doing the shameful act after shameful act upon his body. And then we see that because of the poor excuse of a leader and the example that these men set, well, if they're doing it, of course, the others are going to follow in suit. And so the men of this council begin to do it, and so the officers who are there, they begin to do the same thing. The end of verse 65, and the servants did strike him with the palm of her hands. Again, that word servants being referenced to the officers who were there. They begin to slap him. Now look at this. This is not a punch. This is an open palm slap. what is that? That's to inflict, yes, pain, but shame. That's what that was to do. It was all shame. And it was all as Jesus said it would be. Back in Mark chapter 10, Jesus said this: "The Son of Man shall be delivered unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles, and they shall mock him, and shall scourge him, and shall spit upon him, and shall kill him, and the third day he shall rise again." Jesus knew everything that was going to take place. He knew it all. He knew it all down to the very fists, again, as I said earlier, that were going to come into contact as they blindfolded him, punched him in the face. He knew it, and he didn't stop it. He kept going. He kept moving forward. He kept going to Calvary. They hated him. They hated him because of his message. They hated him because, as we've talked about extensively, because he wasn't what they expected the Messiah to be, because they had this idea in their minds of what the Messiah was going to do, and Jesus was not what they expected, and so they hated him because of that. They hated him because, I think most importantly, because he exposed their sin, because he was light, and they were darkness, and the darkness does not like the light, because the light exposes the darkness. That's what John tells us in John chapter 3. And that's important because it's the same thing that's happening still today. And Jesus said they will hate you because they hate me. Why? Because we, as the ambassadors of Christ, expose their sin. We, as the ambassadors of Christ, speak with authority, only the authority that this book gives us, but with authority. And we, as ambassadors of Christ, aren't typically what people expect us to be, because you know what? They have an idea in their head of what Christianity is, and it's more often than not what this book says it ought to be. And so they hate you. Now the thing is, they don't really hate you. They hate the one who sent you. And if they were there that day, as much as people like to think that they wouldn't, they would have been in that crowd, and they would have been crying out, "Crucify him." And just as Jesus stood there and endured, they have a message they need to hear, and he's chosen us to tell them. And so if we get anything through this Calvary story, what it ought to be is that it was not done for naught. Now, we understand this in the means of our salvation, but it means so much more. Just as he went and endured the shame and everything that he endured in order to make salvation possible, friends, we've been called to endure a lot of things in order to get the message of salvation to the people who need it. I've said it a million times before, I'll say it again. There's a reason we're here. There's a reason why he doesn't just zap us off to heaven the moment we get saved, right? There's a reason why we've been left here. It's because there's a message to tell. So the world is the same today. There's no difference in the world today and the world who was doing this to Christ. They hate him. And because they hate him, they hate those who follow him. But in all of that, let us lift him high. Let us glorify him, because he was brought low and was shamed for us. Let's pray.